Please, O Lord our God, make the words of your Torah sweet in our mouths. Please, O Lord our God, make the words of your Torah sweet in our mouths, in the mouths of your people, in the mouths of the house of Israel, in the mouths of your people, in the mouths of the house of Israel.
Well, welcome everybody to Congregation Ruach Israel for this very special interview. I had different thoughts about how to do this. I was going to start out with Marty the puppet, but we decided against that. Somehow didn't seem to fit the atmosphere of what we're trying to do. I thought I'd play you some jazz. That didn't seem to work either. So we're just going to move right into our very special interview with a very special man, a good friend of mine, and a good friend to many of us, Rabbi Dr. Mark Kinzer. So let me tell you a little about him, and then I'm going to ask you, Mark, to talk more about yourself, because your story is very interesting. Mark is the past president of the Messianic Jewish Theological Institute, and I'm the current president. So that's kind of a neat thing. And of course, in my leadership of the institution, trying to follow much of what Mark brought to us in the early years, because he really is a shaper of the modern Messianic Jewish experience in a way that it's hard to imagine anybody who's had quite the same impact. Mark now is the senior rabbi of Congregation Zera Avraham, which is in Ann Arbor, Michigan, a nice city, a very, very we got some Michigan fans here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Has a PhD from the University of Michigan, and he's written a number of books. The most important from a Messianic Jewish standpoint is called Post-Missionary Messianic Judaism. And I'm going to ask him to talk a little bit about that later on. But, you know, frankly, to me, Mark, and I'm going to refer to you by your first name, and you can refer to me similarly if you'd like. One of the things that helps me trust you is that you're a regular guy. You know what I mean by regular guy? I mean, this type of thing. He goes into mourning when Michigan loses to Ohio State at the end of the season.
Every year I do.
Every year. He's saying the Kaddish, you know, for the quarterback. And he, you know, seriously, he runs several miles a day. What are you up to? About
4.5.
4.5 miles. Not bad for a senior citizen, you know, like me. And but I think your humanness came out most clearly and unambiguously when your lovely wife Roz and you spontaneously broke into a rousing chorus of Redneck Woman. And then I knew I was dealing with a regular guy and his regular wife, not some ivory towerish person. I don't like that song, but the fact that Mark and Roz sang it. So I say we welcome Ruach style Mark Kinzer to us. So, Mark, let me ask you an initial question. What brings you to Beantown? What brings you to Boston?
Well, I am part of an initiative these days which is called the Helsinki Consultation on Jewish Continuity in the Body of the Messiah. And it's a kind of coalition of Messianic Jews, Jews from the Protestant, Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox churches. In a recognition that Jews who believe in Yeshua, wherever they are, should be maintaining their Jewish identities, and that we need to find ways to support one another in doing that. And when we see that there's a unique way that Messianic Jews are able to provide support for these Jews within these other contexts, and but also contributions that they have to make to us as well. And so I am here with my co-chair of the Helsinki Consultation,
who we're going to introduce a little later. Yeah.
And the two of us had some meetings a couple of days ago where we were meeting for part of the day with some Catholic friends, and then in having dinner with a Jewish Episcopalian priest. And so that was what brought us to Boston this time around.
Well, we're glad to have you here, to say the least. But let's begin at the beginning. What kind of kid were you? Were you bookish? What were you interested in?
Yeah.
What did you do as a kid?
Yes. Well, really, there were two primary passions, I would say, that I had. And one was sports. I was the youngest of three boys in my family, and both of my older brothers were rabid football, hockey, baseball, basketball fans, and so I just grew up learning from them, and particularly football fans. And so, the Sunday of football season was always like a very special religious holiday in our home. We actually, this was in the 1950s, I had a special antenna installed in our house that would allow us to get a station, a TV station from about maybe 100 miles away that televised the home football games of the Lions, because they were blacked out in those days, So
Our sound man,
Okay.
would like you to hold on to that, so that'll work better. Okay, good. So yeah, so football was important,
and then
Yeah.
music. Music was of great importance to me, but it was initially it was folk music. My elder brother was part of a folk group in the late 50s, early 60s, during the whole hootenanny phase of things. And so when other kids were simply listening to popular music, I was listening instead to the Weavers and Joan Baez and Judy Collins and Bob Dylan and
so the point is your theological acumen grew and your musical taste declined to Redneck Woman. I think that's what we're talking about here. But anyhow, so go on. So it was music and it was sports.
And it was music and sports. And I loved to read as a kid, but what I remember reading most when I was maybe 9 or 10 or 11, I would read books about athletes, about famous athletes, and the Lou Gehrig story, or I just those were the things that were engaged me. As I became a teenager, I loved novels, but the kinds of novels that always drew me were the ones that were about serious philosophical questions. And so I became strongly attached to the great Russian novelists, reading Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. That was probably more as I got
We
into
interviewed
15,
Tolstoy
16, or
last
17.
week here, by the way. But Mark, talk about the religious identity at home.
Yes.
I get the sense that you were, like a lot of us, and for what you've said so far, a fairly secular guy.
Yes.
Being Jewish. Talk about it.
Yes. No, that's very, very much the case. It's kind of strange because my father was as involved with synagogue life as one could possibly be involved. The synagogue that our family was part of was a small synagogue, and it was the last residential synagogue in the city of Detroit. The Jewish community had moved out into the suburbs, and where we lived was still within the city limits, but it was just barely within the city limits, and it was the last Jewish community in the city of Detroit. And my father and his two brothers were the machers. They were the leaders of this particular synagogue. And my dad was at synagogue every day. He would go at least once, either for the daily Shacharit service or the Mincha Marav service in the evening, and often he was at both. And the synagogue was very much central to his existence. On the other hand, his Judaism didn't translate, he didn't bring it into our family life. It's kind of odd. I mean, my brothers and I, we all had the usual type of preparation for bar mitzvah, and then, as is usually the case, when we had our bar mitzvah, then we were free from having to have any Jewish education. We had fulfilled our obligations.
Like so many of us,
Yes.
the same deal. Bar mitzvah came, and that was it.
That was it. And
Yeah.
there was really no pressure to go further, and even if there had been, it probably wouldn't have done any good.
Right.
So we had this sense of, Judaism was there through my father, and there was this institution, the synagogue, that was playing an important part of in our family's life simply because my dad was there so much.
Right.
But we weren't there.
Right. We get it. We get it. Now, I want to move ahead. And by the way, let me tell the audience, think about specific questions you'd like to address to Mark later on. I want to give you that opportunity toward the end of this, but I don't want to keep you here all afternoon at the same time. So let's move ahead a little bit, Mark. Tell us about how you came to embrace Yeshua, Jesus, as the Messiah of Israel. How did that happen?
Well, when I was I was in high school at this very tumultuous period in American life in the late 1960s. I had a friend who was the first hippie in our school, and he was one of my favorite guys. I admired him. He was doing the things I wish I could do, and I admired this guy. He was very smart, very well read, and hair all the way down his back, and had I shared a lot of ideals that with him, but he was living them out as a good hippie. Well, he then came to believe in Jesus, and that was quite striking to me. But he was not then part of some church. He was part of the Jesus movement, and so he went from being a hippie to being a Jesus freak, and so this was intriguing to me. Organized religion was not intriguing to me, but what he was doing was intriguing to me, and I was interested in serious philosophical questions. I thought about things like, in particular, I thought about death. I thought about, I remember lying in bed and trying to imagine not existing. Try that sometime.
Let's all try it right now.
No, but honestly,
No, it's very
you
serious.
really, it was mind-boggling for me to just think about not being, and so I remember considering that. Well, I couldn't imagine how people could go through life without continuously thinking about death. It seemed like really about the only important issue to think about, because otherwise, I mean, in the light of that reality that we all face and will face at some point, I mean, what is then the meaning of everything that we're doing now? So that was those are the kinds of questions that I thought a lot about without having any answers to them. I went off to college for my first year at the University of Michigan, and I was greatly looking forward to this. This was going to be my experience of independence, but also I was going to this place with all these incredibly smart people who had obviously thought about all these kinds of the questions that were on my mind, and I thought I was going to get some answers just through being in that world. And I was just very let down, disappointed after my first year that there were lots of really smart people who were articulate and persuasive, and none of them agreed with one another. So it was obvious there was no like one coherent worldview that seemed to be conveyed in that setting and that made any sense to me. And so I think through all of this, I was beginning to wonder, was there some kind of reality or world beyond this that could give some kind of clear meaning and direction and purpose to all of this? And I was more open to the possibility that was true than at any other time in my life. And so the real issue for me, by the way, at this point, wasn't Jesus. It was simply the existence of God. I mean, that was the issue for me. I was an agnostic, but who was deeply concerned about whether God existed and whether God was real and whether God was active in this world. That was really the question.
And we're talking around 1971.
1970, 71.
Same
Yes.
time. Yeah.
And so the turning point was in that summer between my first and second year at the university. I took a 7-week trip to Europe. And I had 3 very close friends in Ann Arbor, and this was like the first time in several years where any of us had been apart from one another for an extended period of time. They'd been my high school friends, and then we went off to college together. And in those 7 weeks, I don't know how to describe it. I encountered God, and through people that I talked to, through books that I read, through visiting cathedrals and in Europe and other types of settings. By the end of those 7 weeks, as I was flying home on the plane, I was asking God if God was real. Again, I wasn't thinking so much in terms of Yeshua or Jesus. It was a question of, is God real?
Sure.
And then the first thing, I was met at the airport by my 3 friends and my parents, and I discovered very soon that in the 7 weeks I'd been gone, all 3 of my friends had come to faith in Jesus.
Interesting.
And it just bowled me over, and they had been terrified of my coming home, because they thought, oh, Mark is going to try to argue us out of this rather fragile faith that we have. And of course, we had a history of debates and intense knockdown, drag-out arguments, and so they were as surprised and relieved, as I was. And so, the issue of Yeshua just kind of came in because the only people I knew who had experienced God in the way in which I was now encountering were people who believed in Jesus. I didn't have Jewish friends who related to God in that way. Who knows? Maybe if I'd had Jewish friends who were Hasidic Jews at that time, the course of my life would have been different. Right. I just didn't know any Jewish people who talked to God in that way,
right.
and had that kind of intimate, familiar relationship, with God. If I'd known Tevye, maybe he would have been able to help me,
Right.
So that was the initial encounter, and then I spent time with my high school friend who had been this Jesus freak, and he was the one who then introduced me to my first teacher, who happened to be a Jewish believer in Yeshua.
And this was Haskell Stone, right? And
right.
And in a word, Mark, tell us a little bit about Haskell's. This is a Messianic Jewish guy. By profession, he was a social worker, extremely bright, extremely well-read. And what was his big exhortation to you at that time? It was something very decisive.
It was very decisive and really quite remarkable for the time period. Again, this is 1971. If you think about it, the Messianic Jewish Alliance was still called the Hebrew Christian Alliance in 1971. It hadn't changed its name, I think, until maybe 1975. The Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations didn't come into existence until, I think, 1979.
Right.
And so this is 1971, and so within just a couple of weeks of my coming to believe in Yeshua, I was sitting with this man, and he tells me, Mark, you need to realize that you're believing in Jesus and Yeshua means that you need to even be more faithful as a Jew than you were before. You should go back to synagogue with your dad. He said, if you get married, marry a Jewish girl. I mean, these are the kinds of things my parents had been, of course, telling me for years, and I had said, I'm not interested, And then the final thing he said to me was, he said, don't become part of a church. And it wasn't because he was hostile to churches, but he said, if you become part of a church, you will lose your Jewish identity. You will become assimilated, and you need to live your life as part of the Jewish people.
Right. So often true. So, Mark, let's think about Yeshua for a minute here. And when you consider him, what is the one thing that you find most absolutely compelling about his person? That's a hard question because there's so much. Yeah. But if you can reduce it, make it one or two. One or two things that you think are just so unique, so compelling about this first century Jew that he therefore deserves our attention as Jewish men, Jewish people.
I think one of the first things that struck me was this note of absolute authority with the way he speaks. That makes it so difficult. I mean, if you when I first read the Gospels, when I first read the Besorot, it was that sense like that comes through, especially clearly in Mark, in the Good News according to Mark, this sense of the way Yeshua speaks with authority, teaches with authority, the Amen, Amen, I say to you. I was just taken aback by this. I mean, there was no tentativeness, It was so assertive that I sensed, well, either this guy is an egomaniac and crazy, or there's something absolutely unique here, that I have to pay attention to.
Or he's a liar, and therefore he's demonic.
Yes, exactly.
But both of those possibilities make no sense.
That was the other thing. You see, what goes with it then is this message of humility and servanthood. This sense of the person who would be first must be last. The person, who wants to be great needs to be the least of them all. And then the way he washes the defeat of his disciples. When you try putting that message and his own actions together with this incredible assertiveness and authority, they kind of don't compute, but it was that combination. It was the latter thing that made me realize I couldn't simply look at this guy as either crazy or demonic. That there was something far more powerful here, and I could see how this one could be so transformative in the lives of so many.
He's impossible to understand if we disallow him his claims. Yeah. He's impossible. I'm agreeing with you. It's the same thing that just has always grabbed me about Yeshua, so profound. So in the early years of your being his follower, All right, you were with Haskell Stone. He was teaching you. What was your life like? What was your corporate life? What was your congregational life or fellowship life, however you want to put it? What was that like for the first several years?
Well, when I went back to school at the University of Michigan, I took Haskell's direction very seriously, and I said, okay, well, I'm not going to look for a church. And I probably wasn't so inclined to look for a church anyways, because it was the Jesus movement was what really grabbed me, and it tended to be somewhat non-institutional in its approach to things. The group that I first discovered on the campus at the University of Michigan was this group that wasn't a church. In fact, it had members of a variety of different churches and people who were not part of any churches at all. What it was an ecumenical, charismatic community that was founded by Roman Catholics, of all things. It was called the Word of God in Ann Arbor, and it was one of the two founding communities of the Catholic charismatic movement. By the time when I got involved with it, there were already probably 1,000 people in it, and it had tripled within another 10 years. And this group really, I hadn't seen anything like it before. It fit my countercultural sensibilities. You had these large households of people who were living together, a family with 4 or 5 single people. You had many of these folks who were living in common, who had put all their goods in common. At one point, there were about 150 or 200 people who had all put all of their financial resources together in common. And so it was this radical, intentional community, and that it went along with my somewhat socialist type ideals of that period of my life, and communitarian type of vision. And so the thing that made it work for me as a Jew, in light of Haskell's advice, was there was no pressure for me to be part of any particular church tradition. In fact, because it had a diversity of traditions represented, I was even encouraged to explore more my Jewish life. And so I started to go to synagogue, the conservative synagogue in Ann Arbor. And so the way my life was, after I graduated from the university, I simply started to work within the life of this ecumenical community, and I was, living with these groups of Catholic and Protestant folks, and I was going to shul on Saturday, and that was great. With everybody was fine with that. At a certain point, in fact, a group of Messianic Jews who were part of the community began to form together and do things together, and we actually built a little Messianic Jewish neighborhood in the 1980s with about, I think there were maybe 5 families, and then I was there with a group of single guys, and we did a number of things together. I feel like in some ways I would love to see some of that happen now.
Well, it is happening now. We have Ruach House, right? Ruach House is an attempt at intentional community within the framework of our synagogue here in downtown Boston. So I wonder if we're going to see a recapitulation of what we experienced 50 years ago in the late 60s and 70s for another interview. But tell us a little bit about your first encounters with the kind of Messianic Judaism that you and I and others of our friends have gotten involved in many years ago. How did that all come about? And then after that, we're going to move into some real substantive issues related to Messianic Judaism.
Well, my first experience of Messianic Judaism outside of just my own life in Ann Arbor was in 1977, participating in a conference that our community had helped to co-sponsor. It was this multi-denominational conference with about 50,000 people in Kansas City. And as part of that conference, there was a Messianic Jewish subconference. And I was assigned to be the administrator for the conference. And the person who was chairing the conference, the Messianic Jewish Conference, was David Stern. David Stern, who many of us would know as a translator of the Jewish New Testament and the complete Jewish Bible. And so David and I became really good friends at that time, and I was able to get a sense of his vision, and he, in that conference, he led a liturgy that was a Messianic Jewish liturgy that was really quite traditional in its form, and so from that point on, I kept contact up with David and was following the things that David was doing, and my orientations were very similar to David's, because I had already been going to synagogue for several years at this point. I was very comfortable in a traditional Jewish setting. And the next stage of things was, it took place in the 1990s, so we moved forward almost 20 years, or no, it was actually about 13 years. The community in which I was living went through a major split, and that led to the Messianic Jews that were part of it forming our own congregation and going our own way. And so at that point, I started attending conferences for the UMJC. And I could tell that of the different organizations in the Messianic Jewish movement, that the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations was closest to my own sense of where things should go. What I was especially looking at was the importance of being able to both affirm, learn from, and incorporate aspects of Jewish tradition in our life as disciples of Yeshua, but also to do it in a way that was not hostile to the history of the church, that had an ecumenical appreciation for the varieties of Christian churches, and in such a way that we realized we had to go develop our own distinctive pattern that was not theirs, but to do it in a way that was not in reaction to them and as an attack on them. And then I think, though, the other thing that was key for me in my early experience in the UMJC and in the Messianic Jewish movement as a whole was, while I felt like this was the best environment that I could find within the Messianic Jewish movement, there still seemed to be a rather superficial quality to the Judaism. And that's because I had already at that point, this was in 1993, I had been attending a conservative synagogue for almost 20 years. And so I was very familiar with what Jewish life felt like, and Messianic Jewish life in various conferences and settings seemed to me rather artificial and superficial. It still seemed like evangelical Christianity with saying Yeshua rather than Jesus. And I think a real turning point for me was being at a conference in 1996 where I met Paul Saul for the first time, and where I met Michael Schiffman for the first time. And I had gotten to know Stuart Dowerman the year before that. And I sensed with these guys that they just, unlike anyone else I had met, these were people who were on exactly the same wavelength as I was. And so that was the beginnings of what ultimately then would become Hashivenu.
Yeah, Hashivenu, the think tank that we've been involved in, and other initiatives. We'll talk about them. Okay, so Mark, here's the thing. You started writing, because you had written previously. Yes. We have one of your earlier books upstairs. But you wrote a book called Post-Missionary Messianic Judaism. And could you describe, real briefly, the salient, most important points of that book? What are the key elements that make it distinct, unique, and of course, we find it very, very helpful?
Yes. Well, perhaps the best way of summing it up, and this cannot possibly communicate the drama of the book. You know, I sometimes, unlike anything else I've ever written, this book, while on the one hand it's a kind of, you could look at it as a dry academic theoretical exercise, it was the way it turned out is has a certain arc to it, where you get to a certain point and you realize you've been had. You know, where there's a logic to it that leads you to a particular point, and you might not realize where it was going, and then suddenly, it's like a trap that falls. And so I'm not going to give that all away. If you haven't read it, you'll need to read it yourself and see if you can pick out where the trap falls. What I can do is summarize the book in terms of 5 affirmations that are found at the very end of the book, where I basically summarize in the next to last chapter what I'm asserting, and what I argue for is what I call a bilateral ecclesiology, and I'll say more about that, in solidarity with Israel, with the Jewish people as a whole, that affirms God's enduring covenant with the Jewish people and the traditional Jewish way of life, and the tradition, the whole history of the Jewish people, which mediates that way of life to us, and so the notion of a bilateral ecclesiology is this idea that the ecclesia, the body of Messiah, is essentially twofold. That it's one reality that always has these 2 different expressions, and one of those expressions is Jewish, and one is what you might call multinational or Gentile, and that these 2 are bound together in unity and in fellowship, but they always maintain their distinctiveness. And the idea here is that the Jewish expression needs to always needs to find a corporate form. That it's not enough to simply have individual Jews scattered in the midst of the church. That Jewish life is always a life in community among other Jews, and so there has to be a way that the Jewish people within the life of the ecclesia are sharing a life together as Jews. The second element was in solidarity with Israel, and what this means is that Jewish expression within the life of the ecclesia itself needs to be inserted into the inner life of the Jewish people. And then when it is, it then becomes a contact point that brings this Church of the Nations into relationship with the Jewish people as a whole. So bilateral ecclesiology in solidarity with Israel, and then that affirms God's irrevocable, unbreakable covenant with Israel, the Torah as Israel's corporate constitution, through time, what the Torah means for Jewish life.
Mm-hmm. What if you had a message for Jewish believers around the world who are primarily affiliated with historic Christian denominations? What would that message be?
Well, I often think about some passages in Pirkei Avot that talk about drawing people close to Torah, and thinking about Torah here, not just as like a set of individual practices, but thinking about Torah as this rich and dynamic tradition of study and engagement with Jewish thought and Jewish life. And thinking about Torah that way, because often when Torah in these Jewish sources is referred to, it's Talmud Torah. It's the study of Torah, which then leads to Jewish practice. My greatest concern would be for Jewish disciples of Yeshua, wherever they are, in whatever kind of Christian context, is to engage, to re-engage with Jewish study, and to find some way of simply engaging with Jewish communities and the Jewish people. And it wouldn't focus so much on what they need to do in terms of their church setting or their primary communities of reference and all of the different practices that they would need to do. That, I think, is the sort of thing that gets worked out in the lives of individuals in relationship with God as they're moving, more and more in the life that God has for them. But I think that this essential thing is like Jewish learning, and Jewish learning with other Jews, as like the dynamic starting point for everything else. Mm-hmm. And then I think that Hashem will do what Hashem is going to do in people's lives.
In our context, we focus a lot on connecting with Jews in other institutions. There's music.
Yes.
There's so much in our city here that we think that those kind of connections are important as well. Not to trivialize what you're saying. Okay, so based on the book, based on the idea of bilateral ecclesiology, what message do you have? Because there are a number of Jewish believers who are not affiliated with churches, but who are just on their own. They, in their hearts, believe that this guy really is the Messiah, but they don't know what to do with it. Yes. What would your advice be to them?
Yeah. I think that this is especially an issue for us in American society right now, because we are, it is, our social context is so highly individualistic, and we've lost a sense of what it means to be part of communities, and so people often are drawn to spirituality. They'll often say, even, I've got a spirituality rather than a religion, but often what that really means is I'm just working out on my own system and way of operating, and my life is not bound up with in its journey with the journey of a community of people through time. And I think that leads to really impoverished both human and spiritual life, and that, as hard as it is for us in our individualistic ways, we're never going to actually find the fullness of what God has for us in our lives, or what Yeshua has for us in our relationship with Him, unless we're bound up with communities that are themselves on a journey with Hashem. I think for us as Messianic Jews, whose identity is so bound up both with Yeshua and with the Jewish people, in particular, we have to find others who share that faith in Yeshua and share that identity as Jews and that love for the Jewish people. We can't, if we don't, ultimately one of those parts of our life and identity is going to suffer, be diminished, or simply be lost. Either our life as Jews or our life as disciples of Yeshua. But also, that even apart from that, it's just a question of realizing the reason we exist. It's not just a question of fulfilling ourselves. It's a question of recognizing there's a unique calling, a mission, a purpose for Jewish disciples of Yeshua, Jewish believers in Yeshua. And it's not it is a purpose that we can only fulfill together. We can't accomplish it simply as individuals.
And beyond that, Mark, my observation, having been at our synagogue for 36 years now, is that we become very vulnerable as human beings, even apart from this lofty calling and this calling as Jews who believe in Yeshua, without the implicit accountability that comes with communal life, with all of its challenges and all of its hassles and all of its everything, we are extremely vulnerable in a culture which offers so many temptations, so many seductions, powerfully and compellingly. So we say a hearty amen to that sentiment at every level, and certainly commend to anyone watching this video that Rabbi Mark's and my understanding would be that everyone needs to be in community. And of course, a Messianic Jewish community has the advantage of putting together the disparate elements, the seemingly opposite and irreconcilable elements of our lives as Messianic Jews, by putting them together so that we can observe and live Jewish lives, but exalting Yeshua in the midst of it. So that's certainly really, really important stuff all the way around. How have attitudes toward Yeshua and Messianic Jews changed, in your view, in the larger Jewish community in the West, particularly in America, over, let's say, the past 30 years or so? Do you sense any changes, and what are they like?
Yes. I think there have been significant changes. I think the changes that will occur in the next 20 or 30 years are going to be even more dramatic. But in reality, I think they're going to be merely, at some point, there's going to be a breaking point where we'll see dramatic evidence of a change. But that breaking point will simply have been the climax to a set of smaller incremental changes that were leading up to it. I think that early on, the 1970s and 1980s, and beyond, the tendency in the wider Jewish world was to simply dismiss us as a Protestant sect, a direct extension of the Christian missions to the Jews, as therefore being deceptive, dishonest, in effect implicitly a critique that we're even insincere, that we are just adopting these practices in order to pull the wool over the eyes of unsuspecting Jewish children and young people. And now that suspicion still exists in the minds of certain leaders in the Jewish world, especially some older ones who had it earlier on and have simply never changed. I think at a certain point there were a number of Jewish people who realized that was just too simplistic. That there are a lot of these Messianic Jews who do this stuff because they really believe it. That being Jewish to them is really important. I think at that point they probably had more compassion on us in thinking that we were deluded still. Not that we were deceiving other people, but we had kind of deceived ourselves in thinking that we could have our cake and eat it too. That we could be, from their point of view, Christians and Jews at the same time. And the reality was, of course, you can't do it. And so it was less hostile. It was less a sense that we were the enemies, and it was more just the sense of, you guys are simply, this can't be done. Sorry, and I think even at that point they also tended to think that while we were sincere, our Judaism was paper thin, and I think in that stage they were right. This, was at a point, as I mentioned, where my initial experience of Jewish life in the Messianic movement, when I first got involved with its corporate life in the 1990s. And that was my own assessment. And I think that again, was the assessment of many Jews at the same time. I think in the last 10 to 15 years, there are many in the Jewish world who are coming to experience Messianic Jews where our Jewish life is clearly not paper thin, and where they are more taken aback and surprised, puzzled, and don't know what to make of us. And so I think confusion is more common today among certain Jewish leaders. They won't publicly say that. They have to still toe a clear line that now they're simply trying to do something which is impossible to do. They're either deceiving others or deluded themselves. In reality, these days, I know from talking to some people in private who will say things in private that they wouldn't say in public settings when their guard is down. That they don't know what to make of this. And then, of course, we now have a handful of leaders within the Jewish world who are even willing to go further and say, no, these Messianic Jews, where they deserve to be taken very seriously, and they've been given a raw deal within the Jewish community. And I think we're going to find more and more of that in the coming years. The final point, I think, that just showed this on the ground level more was the whole Pew Research poll that was asking Jews in general whether it was possible to believe in Jesus and be a Jew. And I don't remember the exact number. It was in the 30s, maybe 30.
Which is astounding.
It was astounding that a third, basically more than a third of the Jews who responded said yes. Now, we might wish it were over 50%, but the fact is 20 or 30 years ago, that figure would have been far, far lower. Now, the reasons for these changes are not all because of our a lot of it is coming because of these changes within the Jewish community itself, the astronomical rates of intermarriage, and therefore kids growing up in these such situations where they have as much exposure to Christianity as they do to Judaism, and with synagogues opening up and having Christian spouses that can become members of conservative synagogues, and so it suddenly becomes much more difficult to hold the kind of lines that the Jewish community has held.
But it's harder to hold any kind of line in a postmodern society. So we're also seeing, Mark, some very positive trends on the Christian side of the equation. We have, and you and I have been involved in the dialogues with the Vatican folks, and we're finding very high-level Christian leaders saying, you Jews, it's not only okay for you to do Jewish things, but there's something really meritorious and right in the economy of God for you guys to do these things. So don't we see an amazing thing occurring where Messianic Jews are becoming more of that bridge, if you will, that seems to be manifesting for lots of sociological, psychological, religious reasons. So all very, very exciting. Let me ask you this. We're finding nowadays more and more non-Jewish believers, particularly those disenfranchised from their own historic communions, right? And they're digging Israel. They're liking Israel. They're liking us. They're liking Jewish things. What's the right way for Christians who really care about Israel, care about the Jewish people, and have a positive feeling for Messianic Jews? What's the right way, in your understanding, for them to make that real, to actualize that? And what are some of the pitfalls that would not be helpful to us, though doing those things might seem a loving act, really doesn't turn out that way?
Yes. Well, I think that I think that the attraction to Judaism among many Christians is really quite striking. And its reasons are themselves complex, and one can find, psychological and other explanations that at times are not so positive. I think there's also something which is simply a work of the Holy Spirit in the life of the church, and it's just part of this broader type of change that you yourself were alluding to, in terms of both the appreciation that Christians have for the potential of Messianic Jewish life, but I think this is the sense of Christians realizing that there's something special about Judaism and something special about the Jewish tradition, that God is in it in some ways, and that the church has missed something by the way it's denigrated that tradition in the past. So I just wanted to start off by saying I see this as a manifestation of something fundamentally good. But it does become challenging for us in the Messianic Jewish movement, because as a movement, I think our primary calling is to be an environment for Jewish people who are followers of Yeshua to live their life as Jews, to be a place where we form communities of Jews. Let's face it, even if we're tremendously successful in both winning Jewish people to faith in Yeshua and having Jews from other contexts who are already believers in Yeshua finding us, no Messianic Jewish community is going to grow by leaps and bounds from Jews alone. On the other hand, with this move of non-Jews, there are hundreds and thousands of them who are interested in Jewish life. And so the experience of every Messianic Jewish congregation is that for every one Jewish new person who comes through the doors of the congregation, there are probably at least 10 that are non-Jews. And if what we simply do is take an approach like a church where our arms are open, come and simply be part of our community to anybody who wants to, what you quickly end up with is an environment where the Jewish participants are swamped. And so purely in the interests of trying to preserve and foster Messianic Jewish life that these Christians, sympathetic Christians, are eager to do, there ought to be this sensitivity to this question, to these issues. There ought to be the sense of, this is a precious jewel, and we want to be sure that we don't do anything that is going to compromise its effectiveness or weaken it. And so I think that the first question that's the first question that a non-Jews should ask themselves who are drawn to this. If they come to a Messianic congregation, they, I think, ought to come with the orientation for sure at first is that they're guests, and that they're there to see what's happening, to learn, to appreciate, to give gifts and bless it, but to not look at it so much like, I'm going to make this my home, and I expect them to simply open up their life to me and make me, fully part of it in every way. And so I think that initial orientation, particularly, should be that one of being of service, being of support, and of treating oneself as if I'm in someone else's house, and they've welcomed me to a meal, but I'm not presuming that I can just move in, and then to look for guidance from whoever's in leadership within that particular Messianic congregation as to how they can be of most help And every congregation, every synagogue is different in how they want to approach these things. And so I don't think I could dictate for every setting, what the right thing is. But I think that disposition of not presuming anything, of wanting to be a blessing and wanting to be a support and wanting to see this thing succeed so much that I'm not going to treat it selfishly as simply a resource for me. I want it to be a treasure for what God has for it to accomplish.
Yeah, as we often say, in Boston there are hundreds and hundreds of churches, but there's really only one Ruach, and it needs to be protected. And so your words are wise. We're getting close to the end here, Mark, so I'm going to ask you to share with us here in Needham. Before I get to that, would you talk for a few minutes about some of the institutions and different, not projects, but the institutional development of Messianic Judaism that you've been involved in, we've been involved in together, of course, with much of this. Name 2 or 3 things that are particularly exciting and meaningful to you.
Yes. Well, the one that I think is of special importance in my mind, that I think could be of the longest, most enduring value, is the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council. And this is a group of Messianic Jewish leaders who have really made a commitment to one another to develop Messianic Jewish life together and to do some serious, what we call halachic work that has never been done before in the Messianic Jewish movement. By halachic work, of course, I mean this study of the Torah in a way that leads us to make practical decisions about our understanding of what the Torah is requiring from us as Messianic Jews, and to make those decisions together. I think it's so important because this is for me the clearest sign of our growing as a community. That we realize we have to make these decisions together. That we're binding ourselves as leaders, and to some extent our communities, to a decision-making process which goes beyond ourselves, and which means for all of us that it's not always going to go the way we think is ideal, but in the interest of being part of a community, that we're going to go forward together and at times subordinate our own judgment, and that's just the way the Jewish people have always operated. With leaders making corporate decisions together. And so the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council for me is like central to everything else. I think the second one I'd mention is one that you, of course, mentioned at the very beginning, Messianic Jewish Theological Institute. Of special importance in both of our lives. I was the first president. You're my successor as the second president. And the Messianic Jewish movement needs educational institutions. I made clear earlier, how important Jewish study is for Jewish identity and Jewish life. And but we also need to be raising up and training leaders for the future, in particular rabbis. And I know this is something you are that's really on your heart, Rabbi Rich. And if we're going to have future members of the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, we have to have future rabbis who are formed in this common orientation which is emerging among us within the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council. And so I think that MJTI is also of tremendous importance, and I am so grateful when I think about my own life or our life and the fruit that's come from the decades of work that we've done, more than, say, the books I've written. What I think about are these lasting institutions that that are just so rich and have such a powerful impact on the lives of the people.
Well, I think that would be a very fitting conclusion to our time together. Mark, thank you so much. And I think it might be nice, however, to have a couple of questions and answers from the peanut gallery. By the way, when I say peanut gallery, do you know what I'm referring to? What? Howdy doody. Good, because I've been mentioning some things lately, and I'm thinking no one knows what I'm talking about. The Dick Cavett Show, Mark says. No one knows the Dick Cavett Show. But I know the Dick Cavett Show. How many of you know the Dick Cavett Show? All right, good. Some of you do. Good.
Shlomi, you've never heard of the Dick Cavett Show.
No, Shlomi.
Did you know about a peanut gallery? Yeah, but you didn't
The
know where it came
term,
from.
didn't know where it, Shlomi, we're going to have to offer a course in MJTI on this very subject. But why don't we, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take the mic. In fact, Paul, could I ask your help? Would you mind giving the mic to anybody who would like to ask a question? So, there we go. Ah, good. Thank you. Ralph is our sound man who set this up. Let's thank Ralph for all he does for us. I'll tell you, this guy, wow. So, but here's the rule, okay? Question, not sermon. Appointed question for Rabbi Mark. Make it as tough as you like. Whatever, any honest question, and Mark will respond. We'll have 3 or 4 of these. And then after that, we're going to take a commercial break, and I have one more guest for us on the show today, a very, very wonderful new friend. But in the meantime, let's start with with a few questions. Who has a question? Raise in the hand. I think that's Cheryl right there, right? Cheryl, ask away.
Okay, so thank you so much for all that you've shared, Rabbi Kinzer. And particularly, I found interesting how the clarity that you spoke with the Jewish person being kind of returned to being Jewish via being Messianic, as well as the boundaries for those of the nations. My question is your thoughts on sort of a third, maybe a third group that would be drawn to Messianic Judaism and maybe even compelled by the Ruach, would be a group of, much like you spoke earlier, of the those that are in exile and restoration. So maybe that would be via intermarried groups coming in, where you have families who are now becoming Jewish families that weren't before, via a member, or those who may have generations back who were lost, these kind of turbulent souls as a book was written, and weren't even raised as Jews, but are brought in from that perspective. How does the framework of what we have as the movement handle that, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yes.
Thank you.
No, that's a great question. And one I think that's of tremendous importance, because I think our own movement is poised to be able to help people like that in really a unique way, and so I really do think our movement exists for these people who are in these kind of, sometimes sociologists will call it a liminal status. They're kind of in no man's land. And I think that one of the things that's so important about the work of the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council is it's the only mainstream Messianic Jewish entity that has developed a conversion process. And one of the main purposes of the conversion process is to deal with these situations. It's not primarily a way of just dealing with the massive number of Gentiles who are in Messianic Jewish congregations. It's there in particular to deal with intermarriage situations where you have families that are religiously divided, but are open to the possibility of closing that divide, or to deal with these situations of people who are non-Jews of Jewish descent, who have this linkage to the Jewish people already, but there's no way of being able to look at them currently as halakhically Jewish in any way. But they are feeling this pull, this pull back to something from their very own past. And in order to be able to help people like that, you have to have some way of normalizing their status, of having a boundary that's permeable, that they can actually cross into with a process that helps them do it with integrity. I really believe that this is a crucial part of what we are about, and it's only going to increase in the coming years because of what I alluded to earlier, the astronomical rate of intermarriage, which means you have more and more now children of intermarriage who are trying to figure the way, and then they're marrying other kids who are children of intermarriage. And so their children, there's so many now who are growing up with a sense that they've got Jewish ancestors, but they have no clue of what they are. And sometimes they're feeling a pull to come to explore this, to come back. I think definitely we are, and to be honest with you, I see this as a kind of rescue of Jewish souls. You know, the Jewish souls that have left the life of the Jewish people and then have all of their children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren basically are lost to the Jewish people. Well, what we're finding is now many of these children, grandchildren, and great-children, they're not lost. They're finding their way back, but there's got to be some way to help them come back.
Good. Let's take one more from this side, and then we're going to invite Father Anton for a moment, and that'll be it. Question from this side.
Yes, Rabbi Kinzer, you mentioned in the beginning that when you came to faith, when you became a believer in God, kind of became a believer in Yeshua at the same time because those were the representatives you had. So it kind of came together. And you mentioned had you known Hasidic Jews who had a personal relationship with God, maybe your path would have been different. Like you said, a lot of traditional Jews would say, hey, exactly. See, that's the tragedy. If only you had known, been exposed to true Judaism, you could have found your spiritual fulfillment within traditional Judaism. And I was wondering how you would speak to that objection. Or
Yes. Well, I think these matters ultimately are always more existential than they are like abstract and philosophical, and that each of us has a particular journey and set of experiences that shape who we are, and ultimately for me, I was explaining this in terms of the people that I had encountered, but at a certain point, I came to the conviction that I was talking to Yeshua, that Yeshua was present for me. Now, I was acknowledging that perhaps I wouldn't have been able to identify him as Yeshua if I had been in a Hasidic world, But I don't know that there's ultimately some way of like mediating between these two ways of approaching things. Ultimately, everyone is operating within a particular their own experiential frame of reference, and I can't refute what that another Jewish person would say about me. Too bad I hadn't been around Jews who had that kind of relationship with God. But I can't refute them. They can't refute me, in believing that it really is Yeshua. For me, believing in it is Yeshua as much for them, in the Chassid who does have a personal relationship with God, that they can't have that apart from Yeshua. They can't refute that either. It's not, and so ultimately, the only way you deal with the questions is then you have to step back and you have to ask more broad type of questions about looking at the New Testament and addressing these other questions that ultimately form your conclusions about what you believe and why you believe it. I did a class of a number of months ago for it was a teleconference class for a seminary in Western Canada, which had about 10 Jewish students and 10 Christian students. And the Jewish students were Orthodox Jews. And it was fascinating to see the questions that they asked. And I tried to just be totally transparent with them. And I think they understood and got where I was at, and there was no arguments. It wasn't, because they realized they couldn't argue with my particular experience of God, and they weren't trying to. And they could see how I came to the place where I was, given what I knew and what I had experienced. That's about all we can do. And then we trust God, the God who revealed himself to us, ultimately in good time will reveal himself in his own way to them too. And he's the one ultimately who mediates these disputes.
Right.
It's not up to us.
Yeah. Very good. Well, listen, I think we should say a giant thank you to Mark for his contribution. And Mark, we're going to say goodbye to you. I want to invite Father Antoine up here. Come on up just for a moment. I want to introduce you to a new friend, Father Antoine Levy. He is a Levi, a serious Jewish guy from Paris. He's got a PhD in philosophy. And Father Levy, the day is far spent, but could you tell us a little bit about what you and Mark and other scholars from Christian denominations, but these are Jews from Christian denominations, what you guys have been working on? So could you take a few moments on that for us?
Yeah, well, we've been involved with Mark for now like 8-9 years, and this initiative called the Helsinki Consultation that gathers theologians from all across the spectrum of Christian denominations and the Messianic movement. And the idea is to try to formulate what would be the profile, the status of Jewish presence in what we call the body of the Messiah. So it's not each one of us remain who we are and where we are, but still we had this experience of discovering that our Jewish identity is and our common faith in Yeshua is sufficient to build a very strong sense of commonality and just have the idea of what we need to do together. There's a sense of a real common task that does not concern only Jews in the church; it concerns the whole church, the whole body of the Messiah. And so we're kind of approaching the second stage of the Helsinki Consultation, and that's the purpose of our journey throughout the United States with Mark. The idea that we've done enough theology now up to this point. It is the moment where we really need to organize this Jewish presence, which means that we need to involve leaders, people who are concretely dealing with Jews in churches, Jews in the Messianic movement, try to really build this Jewish presence, and in a very kind of pastoral, practical level, and doing something which will be global. This kind of dream of having, this kind of isolated Jew in the mountains of Ukraine, develop a chavurah, a group of studies with a Jew who is in Manhattan and another Catholic priest of Jewish origin who is in Jerusalem. This I think will be extremely significant.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Father Antoine. Thank you, and let's be praying for this gentleman, because this guy and Mark and the others who are working with him have something very important. Don't you get a sense that in this crazy world we live in, God is up to something? Don't you get that? Freddie, am I right? He's up to something. He's doing something amazing, and it involves, in small ways, all of you and all of us. Isn't that cool? It's the coolest thing. Abba, we thank you for this afternoon, for this Shabbat, for our friends, and we pray every blessing on their tepes. And may we be filled with joy as we move ahead together. We pray B'Shem Yeshua. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all for coming. And say hi to these guys.
Oh, know your name and study your Torah, for Messiah